Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're headed to Nepal, well, virtually, of course,
Right.
to dig into some really cool research about how vegetation comes back after a huge earthquake.
It's amazing how resilient nature can be.
I know, right? So we're looking at this paper.
Okay.
It's called Vegetation Loss and Recovery Analysis from the 2015 Gorkha earthquake. 7.8 Mw triggered landslides.
FG title.
I know, right?
Yeah.
But don't let that scare you away.
No.
It's really interesting stuff.
Yeah, this study is amazing because it uses satellite pictures to track how things grew back over time.
Like a time-lapse of nature healing.
Exactly. It gives us some really cool insights.
Okay, so back to the earthquake itself. The Gorkha earthquake in 2015.
Right.
A magnitude 7.8.
Powerful.
It caused a crazy number of landslides, over 24,000.
Yeah, 24,826 to be exact.
Wow, that's like one for every parking spot in Manhattan.
And they weren't just little slips either. Over 95% of the damage was from these massive landslides, almost 14,000 of them.
Whoa, so we're talking like whole mountainsides coming down.
Exactly. Imagine that.
It's hard to even picture.
And it wasn't just the trees falling down, you see.
Right.
The landslides ripped away all the good topsoil too.
The topsoil, so like taking away the foundation for anything to grow back.
Exactly, like starting from scratch, you know.
Jeez. So how much land are we talking about here?
The total damaged area was massive, over 8,600 hectares.
8,600. That's huge. Put that into perspective for me.
Think like twice the size of Manhattan just wiped out.
It's hard to imagine anything coming back from that.
I know, but here's the amazing part. By 2021, over half of the vegetation had recovered.
Over 50%. That's incredible. But how?
Well, get this, over 90% of that recovery happened naturally.
Naturally. You mean like without any help from people?
Exactly. Scientists call it self-ecological restoration. It's basically nature doing its thing.
So seeds, spreading plants, recolonizing all on their own.
Yep, the ecosystem's slowly rebuilding itself.
So only about 9.5% of the recovery was due to replanting efforts.
That's right.
That's kind of humbling, isn't it? Makes you
Right.
wonder if we humans always know best.
It really does. It makes you think, like, maybe sometimes the best thing we can do is just step back and let nature take over.
Especially since the Nepal government put a lot of money into restoration efforts, like $3.73 million.
Wow, that's a lot. Did they look into whether that money was well spent?
They did. And this is where it gets really interesting. The study found that protected areas, those places where human activity is limited, actually recovered faster than areas where there was more intervention.
Really? So you're saying the areas they left alone did better than the areas where they were trying to help?
That's what the research suggests. It seems counterintuitive, doesn't it?
It does. So why do you think that is?
Well, the study suggests it's because those protected areas have a few key advantages.
Oh, like what?
For one, they have better soil structure because it hasn't been disrupted.
Right, good soil is like the building blocks for a healthy ecosystem.
Exactly. They also have what they call diverse seed banks, which is like a library of potential plant life just waiting to sprout.
And since they're protected, the ecosystems are more interconnected. So there's a higher chance that plants and animals from nearby can help repopulate the damaged areas.
It's like these protected areas have this built-in resilience because they haven't been messed with by human activity.
Yeah, it's a pretty strong argument for conservation.
It really is.
Yeah.
Protecting what's already there might be just as important, if not more important, than trying to fix things after they're broken.
Agreed.
So we've got this picture of incredible destruction. Mountainsides collapsing, entire forests wiped out.
Right, it's hard to fathom.
But then we also have this amazing story of resilience, nature, slowly but surely taking back the land.
It really is incredible. It makes you wonder what else nature is capable of overcoming.
That's a great question. I'm curious about the timeline of the regrowth. How long did it take for things to start coming back?
Well, they use satellite data to track this something called NDVI.
NDVI.
Yeah, it's basically a measure of how green and healthy the plants are.
Yeah.
They track this NDVI over time to see how the vegetation changed from year to year.
And what do they find?
Well, it takes time.
Okay.
A lot of time, actually.
Okay, so break it down for me. What does the timeline look like?
They estimate it will take about 9 years for the vegetation to fully recover to what it was before the earthquake.
9 years. That's a long time.
It is. But considering how bad the damage was, it makes sense.
I guess so.
Yeah.
And it's not just about trees growing back, right? It's the whole ecosystem.
Right. The soil, the undergrowth, all the animals that rely on those plants. It takes time for everything to come back into balance.
This is definitely more complex than I initially thought.
Oh, yeah. There were a lot of other things that affected the recovery process, things that happened after the earthquake.
Really? Like what What made it harder for the vegetation to grow back?
Oh, remember those intense monsoon rains we talked about?
Yeah, those caused even more problems after the earthquake.
They did.
But how? Don't plants need water to grow?
They do. But
Oh.
too much water, especially when the ground is already unstable, can be a big problem. These monsoon rains dump over 1,600 millimeters of water per year in some areas. That's over 60 inches of rain.
That's a lot.
It is. And when that much rain hits soil that's already loose from the earthquake, it's a recipe for landslides.
So all those new seedlings just get washed away.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the recovery takes a hit.
So the earthquake set the stage, and then the monsoon rains just made things worse.
Exactly. And then you have wildfires, too.
Oh, right. We talked about those earlier.
Yeah, those fires can sweep through and destroy everything. Young seedlings, saplings even damage the soil. It's like taking 2 steps back for every step forward.
It's like Nepal couldn't catch a break. Earthquake, landslides, then rain and fire.
It was a tough situation. But even with all that, the study found that a surprising amount of vegetation did manage to recover.
It just shows you how powerful those natural processes are.
It really does. But we also have to remember the human element, too. People needed to rebuild their homes after the earthquake.
Right, and that must have created some challenges for the ecosystem.
It did. The Nepalese government had a policy of providing timber for rebuilding.
Which makes sense. People need shelter.
Exactly. But of course, cutting down more trees put even more pressure on those forests that were already struggling to recover.
It's a tough situation balancing the immediate needs of people with the long-term health of the environment.
Absolutely. It's a classic dilemma, and it raises a lot of questions about sustainability.
Speaking of human actions, you mentioned that the study looked at the effectiveness of those restoration efforts. What did they find out about that?
Well, there was one year, 2019, that the government called Plantation Year, where they launched a massive replanting campaign.
A whole year dedicated to planting trees.
Yeah, they planted millions of seedlings all across the areas affected by the earthquake.
Millions. Wow, that's impressive. Did it work?
In the short term, yes, it seemed to give the vegetation a boost.
So human intervention can be helpful then.
It can. But the study also suggests that this kind of large-scale planting might not be the best approach in the long run.
Really? Why not? I would think planting more trees is always a good thing.
It seems that way, right? But there's more to it than just putting trees in the ground. For one thing, you have to think about the survival rate of those seedlings.
Ah, so just because you plant a tree doesn't mean it's going to survive.
Exactly. And then there's the ongoing maintenance they might need. Are you going to water them, protect them from pests? And then you have to consider whether the types of trees you're planting are actually suited to that environment.
So it's not just about quantity, it's about quality too. Making sure you're planting the right trees in the right places.
Exactly. It's like gardening on a massive scale.
I'm starting to see why those protected areas where nature was left alone might have done better.
It makes sense, right? Those ecosystems were already in place. They had the right ingredients for recovery, the right soil, the right seed bank. Everything was already interconnected.
This study is really making me rethink some things. I mean, it's not just about plants growing back after an earthquake. It's about how we approach restoration and conservation in general.
Exactly. It challenges us to rethink our assumptions about what's best for the environment. Sometimes our attempts to fix things can actually get in the way of nature's own healing process.
There's a lot to unpack here, and we've only just scratched the surface.
I know, right? There's so much more to talk about.
Well, listeners, we're going to take a quick break, and then we'll be back to explore even more the fascinating complexities of vegetation recovery after the Gorkha earthquake. Stay tuned.
I can't wait.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We're continuing our look at how nature bounced back after that massive earthquake in Nepal in 2015. Before the break, we were talking about those monsoon rains and how they actually made things worse for the plants that were trying to grow back.
Right, those monsoons are no joke.
It seems strange, though. I mean, plants need water, right?
Of course they do. But you have to imagine, you're this tiny seedling.
Okay.
You're barely holding onto a slope that's already been all shaken loose by the earthquake.
Right.
And then suddenly these torrential rains hit.
How much rain are we talking about?
Over 1,600 millimeters per year in some places. That's like over 60 inches of rain.
Wow, that's a lot of water.
It is. And the ground just can't handle it. All that water saturates the soil and then boom, landslide.
And all those seedlings just get washed away.
Exactly. It's like hitting the reset button on all that progress.
So it's not just the amount of rain, it's the timing, too. Coming right after the earthquake when the land was already so fragile.
Exactly. It's a perfect example of how different factors can combine to create a much bigger problem.
And it wasn't just the rain either, right? There were also the wildfires.
Oh yeah, those wildfires were a major setback.
I can only imagine. How do you recover from an earthquake only to have a wildfire sweep through?
It's devastating. Those fires burn away all the new growth, the seedlings, the saplings, they even damage the soil itself.
It's like taking one step forward and then two steps back.
It really is. It felt like nature was testing Nepal's limits, earthquake, landslides, then rain and fire.
Like some kind of obstacle course.
But even with all those challenges, the study found that a lot of vegetation did recover.
Which is a pretty amazing testament to nature's resilience.
Absolutely. But as we talked about before, there's the human side of this too. People needed to rebuild their homes after the earthquake.
Of course.
Mm,
And I imagine that created some tough choices.
it did. The Nepalese government had this policy of providing timber to help people rebuild.
Which makes sense. People need shelter.
Right. But that meant cutting down even more trees, putting more pressure on those forests that were already struggling.
So it's this balancing act between the immediate needs of people and the long-term health of the environment.
It is. It's a dilemma we face all over the world. And it raises a lot of questions about how we can do things more sustainably, even in a crisis.
That makes me think about those artificial restoration efforts that we talked about earlier.
Mm-hmm.
This study looked into how effective those were, right?
They did, and they found some interesting things.
Okay, remind me what those efforts involved.
Well, there was one year in particular, 2019, that the government called Plantation Year.
Plantation year.
Yeah, they basically launched this massive replanting campaign. They planted millions of seedlings in the areas affected by the earthquake.
Millions. That's a lot of trees. Did it work?
In the short term, yes. There was a noticeable increase in vegetation in those areas.
So it sounds like human intervention can be helpful.
It can, but the study also found that this kind of large-scale planting might not be the most effective or sustainable approach in the long run.
Really? I'm surprised to hear that. Why not? Wouldn't planting more trees always be a good thing?
You'd think so, right? But it's more complicated than that. You have to think about things like the survival rate of those seedlings. Not all of them are going to make it.
Right, I guess that makes sense.
And then there's the ongoing maintenance. Do those trees need to be watered, protected from pests? And are you even planting the right types of trees for that specific environment?
So it's not just about planting a lot of trees, it's about planting the right trees in the right way.
Exactly. It's like gardening, but on a massive scale. You have to think about all the factors involved.
It's starting to become clear why those protected areas where nature was left alone did so well.
Those ecosystems were already in place. They had everything they needed to recover. The right soil, the right mix of species. Everything was interconnected.
This study is really eye-opening. I mean, it's not just about plants growing back. It's about rethinking our entire approach to conservation.
You got it. It challenges us to step back and really consider whether our interventions are always helpful, or if sometimes the best thing we can do is let nature take the lead.
There's definitely a lot to think about here.
There is. And we haven't even talked about that 9-year recovery timeline.
That's right. We've got a lot more to discuss about the implications of all this and what we can learn from the Gorkha earthquake.
Absolutely. This research has some important lessons for us, not just about disaster recovery, but about how we interact with the environment in general.
And we're back for the final part of our deep dive on the Gorkha earthquake and what we can learn from it. We've seen how resilient nature can be.
It's amazing, isn't it?
But we've also seen how human actions can sometimes make things harder. So what are the big takeaways? What have we learned?
Well, this earthquake was like a giant experiment.
A natural experiment.
Exactly. You had some areas that were left alone to recover naturally, and then other areas where people tried different things to help.
Then what did we learn from comparing those areas?
The areas that were left to recover naturally often did better. They showed faster regrowth, and they bounced back more strongly.
Wow. So sometimes doing nothing is the best thing.
Sometimes, yeah. That's not to say that we should never intervene, but it does make us think twice about whether our actions are always helpful.
Right. So what are some key takeaways for policymakers and conservationists? What did this research teach us about how to work with nature?
One of the biggest takeaways is the importance of protected areas. Those areas where human activity is limited, they are crucial for biodiversity and for giving ecosystems the space to recover.
So instead of spending millions on replanting programs, maybe we should focus on protecting what we already have.
Exactly. And this isn't just about earthquake recovery. This is about how we approach conservation in general.
Right. This research has implications for climate change, habitat loss, pollution, all kinds of environmental challenges.
It really does. Protecting what we have might be the most powerful tool we have.
And it's not just about protecting the land itself, right? It's also about protecting those natural processes that happen within those ecosystems.
Absolutely. We need to move away from trying to control nature and learn to work with it instead.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
But in the real world, there are always competing demands for land and resources.
Mm.
How do we balance those needs with the need to protect the environment?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? There's no easy answer, but the Gorkha earthquake gives us some clues.
Like what?
Well, remember those challenges Nepal faced after the earthquake? The need to rebuild homes? The monsoon rains, the wildfires?
Right, it was like one thing after another.
It was. And it shows us how important it is to take a holistic approach to environmental management. You have to consider the specific context of each place, the needs of the people who live there, and the long-term consequences of our actions.
So we can't just apply a one-size-fits-all solution.
Exactly. For example, in areas that are prone to landslides, you might need to invest in stabilizing slopes and preventing erosion.
And when it comes to things like timber harvesting, we need to find ways to do it sustainably.
Right, maybe that means using different building materials or finding ways to harvest timber without damaging the forest.
I'm noticing a theme here about community involvement.
Yeah, that's really important. The people who live in a particular area, they have the most to lose if the environment is damaged, and they often have a deep understanding of the land.
So we need to include them in the decision-making process.
Absolutely. When communities are involved in managing their own resources, you get better, more sustainable outcomes.
This is all so fascinating. But what about the rest of us? What can we do as individuals to support a more resilient and sustainable future?
I think the first step is just becoming more aware. Educating ourselves about how ecosystems work and how our actions impact the environment.
So paying attention to our consumption habits, supporting businesses that are doing things the right way, maybe even getting involved in local environmental groups.
Exactly. All those things make a difference. And don't forget about the power of your voice. You can contact your elected officials and let them know that you care about these issues.
This conversation has really been eye-opening for me. I feel like we've learned so much more than just how plants grow back after an earthquake.
Me too. This is really a story about our relationship with the natural world and our responsibility to find ways to live in harmony with it.
Well said. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one message you want our listeners to take away?
I would say this nature has an incredible ability to heal itself, but it needs our help. It needs us to understand it, to respect it, and to work with it, not against it.
That's a great message to end on. So to all our listeners out there, thanks for joining us on this journey. We hope you've been inspired to learn more and to do your part in creating a healthier, more sustainable future for all of us.
And remember, even in the face of huge challenges like an earthquake, there's always hope. Nature is resilient, and with a little help from us, it can bounce back from almost anything.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep asking questions.